Before we get into the latest NBA trade rumors, the 2024 NBA Draft will be live on Chat Sports. We will have coverage of both days, every single pick. We won't skip anything. We've got you covered, so do not miss out. Hit that sub button, youtube.com/chatsportstv. We begin today's show with latest on Paul George, one of the top potential NBA free agents. He has to opt out from his deal with the Clippers, which most think will happen unless he opts in and then immediately demands a trade, which has happened before in the NBA. Here's what Brian Windhorst over at ESPN reports on Paul George. The Clippers have not been willing to meet Paul George's price. He remains unsigned. You can't just look at teams with salary cap space. If Paul George changes teams, it's very likely going to be a situation where he opts into his contract and then requests a trade. A couple reports out there already, one from Marc Stein, that the NBA offseason's probably going to wait a little bit. Not every player, but like some of the big movements might wait for the first big domino to fall. And that's what Paul George ends up doing this offseason. He's moved teams before. He's been a 20-plus point per game scorer. The Clippers don't want to give him the full max contract that he can technically earn, as he is now 34 years old. They're trying to give him a little bit more of a shorter deal with not quite as much money, but Paul George has had the playoff P mantra, right? You know, where it's not always as good in the postseason as it has been at his best in the regular season. But when we look at the realistic available names in free agency, whether or not we count LeBron James, different conversation. You know, Tyrese Maxey's not really a free agent for the Sixers. He's not going anywhere. Some of the teams linked so far to George. The 76ers, who conflicting information on just how interested they are. One report from Shams was, they're out, they're not involved. They've kind of dialed it back. And then another report says from Marc Stein, the league's not buying that as much. The Knicks will come back to here more in depth. The Magic have cap space, and of course the Clippers could always bring him back, with Stein reporting that, the PG wants to go back to LA, but he does want to get the amount of money that he's owed. So prediction time. Who will end up landing Paul George? It is today's pinned comment, so if the ad comes here on YouTube, take advantage of it. Head down there, let me know where you think Paul George plays next NBA season. Wendy also had this about the Knicks as a specific potential destination for George, who they've been linked before, right? But they have to trade for him with the way his contract is set up. They've got a whole bevy of trades that they can make with their draft picks, plus tradable pieces on their roster. Their front office has done a great job to this, specifically Bojan Bogdanovic, the team option for around $20 million in his contract. They could pick that up and use with the draft picks as a big trade piece. You could add another big piece there. That's why people are talking about the possibility of Paul George going to the Knicks. The Knicks, if Paul George wanted, could manufacture a trade without too much sweat and still keep their core pieces together. Now, my guy Marshall Green, our Knicks Now host, had this trade idea. They trade Mitchell Robinson, who will come back at the end of today's show as a possible trade candidate as well. Bogdanovic, Dwayne McBride, 2 first-round picks. Now the Knicks' core roster is Jalen Brunson, Paul George. In theory, they bring back OG. They have Julius Randle. They bring back Isaiah Hartenstein, Dante DiVincenzo, Josh Hart, and then Precious Achiuwa. They got draft picks. They had another notable big man. We know how that team runs their rotation. 8 men is kind of really all they need there. Pretty intriguing roster. It might be a little bit of an older roster, but, you kind of want to go all in at some point, right? So should the Knicks trade for Paul George? Y for yes, N for no. Go vote in the comments of today's video. Let's talk Zach Lavine. This one is very popular following the Bulls' interesting trade for Alex Caruso. You can ask Patrick Seaman on our Bulls channel how he feels about that one. He said too soon when I asked him for a quote. The Kings have been linked as one team. Marc Stein reports these teams are not in the mix. The Utah Jazz and the 76ers. Those teams not having a ton of interest on that front. They seem to be kind of out of it. Minimal interest was the terminology for Stein on the Sixers, and advised to dismiss the Jazz when he talked to one source. Here's what Jake Fisher of Yahoo Sports writes on Lavine, who also mentioned the Sixers aren't involved. If there's any suitor for Lavine that seems most likely at this juncture, it would be the Kings. Sacramento remains active in exploring trade opportunities for Harrison Barnes and Kevin Huerter. League sources told Yahoo Sports, with Huerter receiving a healthy amount of external interest. So more on Lavine to come, but who trades for him? I don't think this is the necessarily easiest trade for a variety of reasons, but who do you think ends up landing Lavine in a trade? The biggest issue here, I think, is the contract. The Bulls are set to pay him $43 million, $46 million, nearly $49 million for 3 years. That final year is a player option, by the way. We'll see if he picks it up or not once we get there. He also has a 15% trade bonus. So that number gets bumped up a little bit. 15% on your $43 dinner bill, it's not that bad. 15% on your $43 million bill, that's a different conversation. Lavine coming off injury last year. He has missed time with injuries. He's an explosive guard. He can jump out the damn gym. But the defense isn't always the greatest, and it's a little tough to figure out where he ends up. Maybe the Kings are a decent fit as they kind of try to win games now, and Fox and Malik Monk and Lavine, maybe that's a good enough defensively guard trio to make it work. Now, you can get the official NBA draft hats over at chatsports.com/NBA draft hats. That link will be in the comments section and the description of today's show. There are lots of them, including throwback style hats. So I would advise searching for your team or filtering by your team because the Mavs fans are going to buy a Knicks hat, right? Go to chatsports.com/NBA draft hats. Link will be in the comments and the description of this video. Every NBA team has one available. Now, as part of Jake Fisher's last article for Yahoo Sports, there were a lot of centers that are apparently on the market. The New York Knicks will begin there. The Wizards have been linked in recent days. He's got 2 years left on his deal, worth a little over $13.5 million. Now, Robinson was banged up this past year. His numbers fell off as well. The Knicks want to make sure they bring back Isaiah Hartenstein as their starter, and they're open. Apparently, they've contacted opposing teams about moving Robinson. What would they get for him? I actually don't know. I'd be very curious to what the Robinson trade market looks like. 2 years at $13.5 a year isn't that bad compared to some of the other center deals we're about to get to, but he hasn't been a double-double guy, right? I think you're looking for that at the center position these days. Next up is Brook Lopez. Now, Lopez is older than several on this list. He's got 1 year left at $23 million, but he's been a 12, 15 point per game guy for several years in a row. He's not an elite defensive player, but the Bucks allegedly are trying to reshape their roster a little bit. Allegedly Houston said that, hey, when you leave us to go to Milwaukee, they might trade you. Seems like that's being the case. Maybe Houston could have interest in adding a vet center, but the money is it's a little bit dicey. Clint Capela, the Hawks center, who he's replaced John Collins as the Hawks player that is on a trade block every single season. He has been a double-double guy, 11 and 10, 11.5 and 10.5 this past season. Not as good as that 2020-2021 campaign, right? He had more blocks, more points, more boards. He is owed, however, 1 year at just under $23 million. He's going to be 30, though. This is kind of getting to the end of his NBA prime, so to speak. Plus, in general, I think once centers lose it, they lose it quickly. Some underlying concern there with Capela given his age. So name a player who you think ends up getting traded. Doesn't have to be a center or George or Zach Lavine. Can be anybody. Let me know in the comments of today's show. Next up is Walker Kessler of the Utah Jazz. Now, Kessler's younger than most here. He has a sub-$3 million deal this year, and then a $5 million club option next year that's got to be picked up by October. You'd probably pick that up. The reporting from Fisher was that rival teams would be willing to engage, or Utah's willing to engage with other teams to take him on. He's been fine. Cheap. Again, would you rather pay 2 years, 13 for fairly similar numbers out of Walker Kessler or for Mitchell Robinson, or would you pay 2 years, 8 for Walker Kessler? Kessler probably has a little bit more value given the age and potential ability to be even better moving forward. What's really interesting on this name list is Isaiah Stewart, the Pistons big man. He, of course, signed a 4-year, $60 million extension last summer, and the Pistons already trying to evaluate the market. That's a bad sign for me. I don't think that's a good thing. His numbers did dip a little bit this year. The rebounds took a pretty big fall off, too. I think Pistons and Wizards both could probably use some better rebounding big men there. I have a tough time seeing a team open to taking on the Stewart contract right now. 4 years, 60 is a lot. So we'll monitor that one, but 460 for Stewart, or 227 for Robinson. I think the Robinson one's a lot more valuable there. So we'll see if Stewart actually ends up getting moved or not.